Well, it's been 10 years since they were kicked out of office in New South Wales, but the stench of corruption from the last time Labor was in government is still grabbing headlines. Even today, with news that former New South Wales ministers Eddie Obeid, Joe Tripodi and Tony Kelly, plus Kelly's former Chief of Staff Laurie Brown, have had criminal charges laid against them following an ICAC corruption investigation. Of course, we know Obeid is in prison, but it's the first time Tripodi, Kelly and Brown have faced criminal charges coming out of ICAC's corruption findings against them. It's just the latest in a sorry sort of political saga that stretched across Premiers Maurice Yemma, Nathan Rees and, of course, Christina Keneally. To get across the latest on this and the rest of the day's headlines, I'm joined now by the Daily Telegraph's political editor, but you'll know him here as a host on Sky News, James Morrow. James, new criminal charges against these three former Labor ministers. On top of everything else we know about it, I've got to say it's one of the most corrupt periods of political government in this country, not just for New South Wales. Is this the end or is there more in store?
Look, you'd have to think, Peta, that this was the end a dozen years on, that they're still digging around, fossicking around, finding these issues. This is about an allegedly doctored cabinet note. I mean, the plumbing, the depth of how far this goes could be potentially endless, but it is interesting now that you are going back to a state election early next year, that all of this is coming back again. And I wonder if it's going to remind some voters of what the battle days under Labor were like, even as Chris Minns, the Labor leader here, seems like quite the clean skin.
All right, the lawyer in me will say innocent until proven guilty.
Of course.
Findings of guilt are a matter for the courts, but we'll see this all play out. Let's talk China. They've put Australia in the trade freezer for some time, but they're clearly getting a bit desperate for our coal because it's reported today they're considering lifting the trade embargo with us so that they can feed coal into their many thousands of coal-fired power stations and, if not here, at least over there, keep their industry alive. Nothing official yet, James, but you know, it's so telling in all this debate about emissions. China's only expanding its coal use, not shutting down its power stations like they're trying to make Australia do here.
Yeah, and yet, Peter, we in Australia, and we saw great examples of this today, act like there's this, magical thinking that we're all a part of, where if we just simply dial down our fossil fuel use, then the number of bushfires will automatically decrease and the floods will decrease and everything will return to some Edenic, harmonic state of nature. Well, of course, that's not true, especially when China, if you accept the science of climate change, is going to dwarf anything that we do in this country. I think, though, more interesting about this story is what's happening behind the scenes in China. Why do they need our coal so desperately? I think it's because they are really looking to take advantage of economic upheaval to keep pumping the world full of their cheap goods.
And they also need to keep people in work for national harmony. I mean, It's a great national security risk for China. If people start to lose work, they won't have incomes, they won't have food. You've got 1 billion people there. I think the concern of the Chinese government about civil unrest is very real.
I think you're absolutely right. And we've already seen lots of cracks appearing in the Chinese economy. There was reports of people not paying their mortgages because they're not able to deal with the banks properly, banks not giving people back their deposits in a lot of these rural banks. It really feels like there's a lot of knife-edge stuff, Peta, that's happening behind the scenes in China. We only see the tip of the iceberg, but of course, keeping 1.3 or 4 billion people fed every day, keeping them in work, keeping their bank deposits safe, all of these things are a big challenge for the CCP, and you have to wonder how much we're seeing of how secure all of that really is.
Right, no surprises here with this one. After their successful run in the federal election, there's talk Teal independents are looking at 2 Victorian seats come the November state election. It comes from 2 advisors connected to Monique Ryan. They're looking at the seats of Kew and Hawthorn, which sit in and around the federal seat of Kooyong, which of course is now held by Ryan. There's talk in Liberal circles that they were going to run in the seat of Brighton, which will be that seat that was just won there by a Teal along the coastal part of Melbourne, until the local Liberal there, a bloke called James Newbury, he had lunch with Simon Holmes à Court, and Newbury then helped deliver a policy over the weekend that the Victorian Liberal opposition are going to cut emissions, they say, by 50% in legislation by 2030. Now, it's a bigger target than Andrews has. Daniel Andrews, bigger target than Anthony Albanese has. But they're saying, Libs are saying to me that this is all because Newbury hoped by having a very green environmental policy, he might keep the Teals out of his seat. I don't know if it's true or not, but it's certainly pretty interesting, isn't it, James?
Well, yeah, it is interesting. I mean, it just shows what this little group of activists are having, what the influence they're having in state and federal elections. We've got the state election coming in New South Wales, and I suspect we're going to see that again as well. But the end effect of this is, of course, to draw the entire political spectrum mostly to the left. And I don't think motions like Newbury's are a good idea if you're just going to keep playing catch up. You have to stand for difference, and that has to be difference not just in these posh Teal seats, but across your entire jurisdiction.
I think they should ask the federal Liberals. Being Labor light didn't help them much in May. I certainly don't think it's going to help them much here in November. James Morrow, pleasure to have you on the show.